1300 over the course of 3 days, recounting his voyage from in the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso, and suggesting that the journey that he undertook was also to be understood as the journey that to some degree typifies that of every man who follows in the footsteps of Christ. Whereas Wordsworth's Prelude, similarly written as an epic, I believe, is suggesting as its subject matter the development and the cultivation of a mind influenced by the world of nature in the same way that he is. And so to some degree, we're not, to compare and contrast here, we're not adhering to the path of Christ himself, because of course that's the journey that Dante himself goes on. It's the journey that Christ himself undertook by being buried, descending to hell, and then on the third day rising from the grave. We are undertaking a rather different journey, one that's far more speculative on Wordsworth's part, and for which there is no actual precedent. He is the one who is blazing the trail here, as it were, and presenting, quite frankly, a different form of paradise, and it's the paradise of the mind wedded to the natural world. And in Book Fifth, he's going to talk about how books influence that period in his life, whereby, and in the process, I think he's going to describe a fall from innocence, and then an imaginative recovery from that fall from innocence. If you want a much briefer account of a similar sort of speculation, one that was of great interest to him, we could look at his Immortality Ode, and I have lectured on it, and I'll try and put up a link here if you're interested in seeing my account of that. But I'm going to begin with a brief reading from Book Fifth. In fact, throughout, I'm going to try to read significant passages of Wordsworth's words, because it's the sentiments are obviously important, but I think it's his framing of them and his language which makes it memorable, and obviously which makes it poetry. So Book Fifth, and the subtitle there is simply Books. What is the relation of books then to the development of the mind? If you think again about Dante, or think about Milton, who I think is his normally his largest influence, these are enormously bookish men. They had read a great deal, and they were guided, in Dante's case, by Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, and in Milton's book by the account in the Bible. But anybody who's read Milton recognizes in that author arguably the most highly read of all poets, and with clear references to countless other works by countless other authors. And part of the delight and to some degree frustration of reading Milton is to wonder where he's getting his ideas from, whether they wholly originate in him or whether they're the composite of ideas of others. And to some degree, there's no answer to that. It is uniquely his own work, and at the same time, it is clearly a work that is appealing to the traditional epic. And the reason it makes the appeal is in order to demonstrate Milton's own vision of what constitutes epic subject matter. So likewise, when Wordsworth chooses to write an epic, he is coveting our comparison of his epic subject matter with that of his predecessors that go from Milton on all the way back to some degree to Homer himself. But I'll begin the reading. Book Fifth, line 1. When contemplation, like the night calm felt through earth and sky, spreads widely, and sends deep into the soul its tranquilizing power, even then I sometimes grieve for thee, O man, earth's paramount creature. Not so much for woes that thou endurest, heavy though that weight be, cloud-like it mounts, or touched with light divine doth melt away, but for those palms achieved through length of time, by patient exercise of study and hard thought, There, there it is that sadness finds its fuel. So not in the failures and in the suffering, but in the successes and the relative meagerness thereof. Hitherto, Wordsworth writes, in progress through this verse, his account up to this point, up to book fourth, my mind hath looked upon the speaking face of earth and heaven as her prime teacher. Intercourse with man established by the sovereign intellect, who through that bodily image hath diffused, as might appear to the eye of fleeting time, a deathless spirit. Thou also, man, hast wrought for commerce of thy nature with herself things that aspire to in unconquerable life. And yet we feel, we cannot choose but feel, that they must perish. Tremblings of the heart it gives, to think that our immortal being no more shall need such garments. And yet man, as long as he shall be the child of earth, might almost weep to have what he may lose, nor be himself extinguished, but survive, abject, depressed, forlorn, disconsolate. A thought is with me sometimes, and I say, should the whole frame of earth by inward throes be wrenched, or fire come down from far to scorch her pleasant habitations, and dry up the ocean in his bed left singed and bare, yet would the living presence still subsist victorious, and composure would ensue, and kindlings like the morning presage sure of day returning and of life revived. But all the meditations of mankind, yea, all the adamantine holds of truth by reason built, or passion, which itself is highest reason in a soul sublime, the consecrated works of bard and sage, sensuous or intellectual, wrought by men, twin laborers and heirs of the same hopes, where would they be? Oh, why hath not the mind some element to stamp her image on in nature somewhat nearer to her own? Why, gifted with such powers to send abroad her spirit, must it lodge in shrines so frail? So, those 49 lines with which he begins this section on books and their influence on him, he then, having expressed these concerns, these sentiments, he then moves on, one day, etc. And so there's something like an invocation that has gone on here. He hasn't actually invoked a muse. There's no sense of a wind coming in at this point, but he's nonetheless meditating on a thought, an idea, and from that idea, he then moves onwards to talk about this. Now, what has he just said here in this? Well, he's talked about the bard and the sage, the poet and the philosopher, and spoken of the two of them as having a similar, if not the same hopes. In fact, he says the same hopes. And the same hopes are to possess of something intellectual and something lasting. And to do so and to create a repository of that labor in the form of books. And Wordsworth's question is, or his sense here is that this is inadequate to the greatness of the thing that creates the books, namely the mind. And so he longs for something that would lodge in a shrine less frail than that of books. So books are simply the dead letter, if you will. It's the dried husk of the spirit that created them. And so he's expressing the inadequacy of the written word to hold the greatness of the spirits that have articulated them. At least that's my understanding of what he's saying here. From that passage, he then goes on to talk about reading, speaks of Cervantes and his work Don Quixote, and then has a very strange segment here, which I want to dally on just briefly. It's a sort of a dream sequence here. Line 70, he says, I passed into a dream. And the dream is a very odd one and mysterious in its articulation, although he does explain what the dream is afterwards, which is rather helpful because it really is quite obscure otherwise. But in the dream, he says, I saw before me stretched a boundless plain of sandy wilderness, all black and void. And as I looked around, distress and fear came creeping over me, when at my side, close at my side, an uncouth shape appeared upon a dromedary, mounted high. He seemed an Arab of the Bedouin tribes. A lance he bore, and underneath one arm a stone, and in the opposite hand a shell of a surpassing brightness. So here is someone who seems a knight on an Arab or a Bedouin on a dromedary, and he has two things in his hands. In the one hand, a stone under his arm, and in the other, a shell. And what do these things represent? That we will find out in a second. But as he says, at the sight much I rejoiced, not doubting, but a guide was present, one who with unerring skill would through the desert lead me. So he's a sort of a guiding figure in the same way that Virgil was for Dante. Note this is a dream segment. And while yet I looked and looked, self-question what this freight which the newcomer carried through the waste could mean. The Arab told me that the stone, to give it in the language of the dream, was, quote, Euclid's Elements, unquote. And this, said he, is something of more worth, and that the word stretched forth the shell, so beautiful in shape, in color, so resplendent, with command that I should hold it to my ear. I did so, and heard that instant in an unknown tongue, which yet I understood, articulate sounds, a loud prophetic blast of harmony, an ode in passion uttered, which foretold destruction to the children of the earth by deluge, now at hand. Okay, so he hears of a prophecy of a great flood that will come to destroy. And no sooner ceased the song than the Arab with calm look declared that all should come to pass of which the voice had given forewarning, and that he himself was going then to bury those two books. The one that held acquaintance with the stars, and wedded soul to soul in purest bond of reason, undisturbed by space or time. The other, that was a god, yea, many gods, had voices more than all the winds, with power to exhilarate the spirit, and to soothe through every clime the heart of humankind. While this was uttering, strange as it may seem, I wondered not, although I plainly saw the one to be a stone, the other a shell, nor doubted once but that they both were books, having a perfect faith in all that passed. Far stronger now grew the desire I felt to cleave unto this man. But when I prayed to share his enterprise, he hurried on reckless of me. I followed not unseen, for oftentimes he cast a backward look, grasping his twofold treasure. Lance in rest, he rode, I keeping pace with him, and now he, to my fancy, had become the knight whose tale Cervantes tells. Yet not the knight, but was an Arab of the desert too. Of these was neither, and was both at once. His countenance, meanwhile, grew more disturbed, and looking backwards when he looked, mine eyes saw, over half the wilderness diffused, a bed of glittering light. I asked the cause. It is, said he, the waters of the deep gathering upon us. Quickening then the pace of the unwieldy creature he bestrode, he left me. I called after him aloud. He heeded not. But with his twofold charge still in his grasp, before me, full in view, went hurrying o'er the illimitable waste, with the fleet waters of a drowning world in chase of him. Whereat I waked in terror, and saw the sea before me, and the book in which I had been reading at my side. Okay, so he wakes from the dream and sees the book from which he had been reading of Cervantes and his Don Quixote, and which had given rise to this dream, the dream of an Arab on a dromedary with the stone and the shell. And the stone and the shell were representative of books. And the one book was of Euclid's Elements, so Euclid's famous work on geometry, or that's just the reason for which Euclid is famed to this day. So a scientific treatise, and the other of something more like a religious work. And the religious work tells of destruction by water. And at that point, he believes that at the point at which the dream sequence ends, he sees the water coming and overcoming everything. And he wakes up in terror and sees the book from which he had originally been reading. Okay, so thereof he leaves. Now, here is the commentary from that vision that he had seen. Now, note that's not in the two-part prelude. This is a new and important passage. And he writes, "Full often, taking from the world of sleep this Arab phantom, which I thus beheld, this semi-Quixote, I to him have given a substance, fancied him a living man, a gentle dweller in the desert, crazed by love and feeling, and internal thought protracted among endless solitudes, have shaped him wandering upon his quest. Nor have I pitied him, but rather felt reverence was due to a being thus employed, and thought that, in the blind and awful lair of such a madness, reason did lie couched. Enough there are on earth to take in charge their wives, their children, and their virgin loves, or whatsoever else the heart holds dear. Enough to stir for these, yea, will I say, contemplating in soberness the approach of an event so dire, by signs in earth or heaven made manifest, that I could share that maniac's fond anxiety and go upon like errand. Oftentimes at least me hath such strong entrancement overcome, when I have held a volume in my hand, poor earthly casket of immortal verse, Shakespeare or Milton, laborers divine." Now, very interesting that at the end of this sequence, reflecting upon the Arab, the semi-Quixote, the dream vision that he saw, he sees again in his own hands a volume either of Shakespeare or of Milton. These are the two figures to whom Wordsworth most regularly refers to as his literary influences. What's going on here? And to some degree, it's not entirely clear, although he does seek to give some clarity to that. But he's talking about the influence, I think, of things that lie beyond our mere literary influences. The influence of something that becomes a great deal of interest in psychoanalytics, the influence of dreams and so forth. But that's not only something that becomes of interest come Sigmund Freud in the psychoanalytic school of psychology. It's obviously also a matter of interest in the ancient world. It's closely allied to the poetic impulse, namely a sort of a poetic frenzied type of madness that overcomes the author, in which the author is imbued by the gods with the capacity for utterance, for prophecy. And here he connects prophecy also with a deluge, with destruction, and is making a connection here at some rate with a power that transcends the mere capacity to put something in speech and write it down. There's a greater power at work there than that. And at that point, then he moves on in Book Fifth to the description of the passage which we saw in the two-part prelude, that of the drowned man. And this is interesting that he moves from a reflection on that and on destruction and of being deluged by water to the passage in which he saw a man deluged by water, and then he will comment on that as well. So let me just read the passage and then note the addition to it that comes thereafter as well, and how he received that. But note the clever connection of one passage with another and how they relate to one another. But I'll read this passage now about the drowned man. Well do I call to mind the very week. Now, in terms of the prelude, this is now 250 lines later from what I just read. So it's line 425. Well do I call to mind the very week when I was first entrusted to the care of that sweet valley, when its paths, its shores, and brooks were like a dream of novelty to my half-infant thoughts. That very week, while I was roving up and down alone, seeking I know not what, I chanced to cross one of those open fields, which, shaped like ears, make green peninsulas on Esthwaite's Lake. This is a lake in the Lake District. Twilight was coming on, yet through the gloom appeared distinctly on the opposite shore a heap of garments, as if left by one who might have been bathing. Long I watched, but no one owned them. Meanwhile, the calm lake grew dark with all the shadows on its breast, and now and then a fish upleaping snapped the breathless stillness. The succeeding day, those unclaimed garments, telling a plain tale, drew to the spot an anxious crowd. Some looked in passive expectation from the shore, while from a boat others hung o'er the deep, sounding with grappling hooks, grappling irons, and long poles. At last, the dead man, mid the beauteous scene of trees and hills and water, bolt upright rose, with his ghastly face, a spectre shape of terror. Yet no soul-debasing fear, young as I was, a child not 9 years old, possessed me. For my inner eye had seen such sights before, among the shining streams of fairyland, the forest of romance. Their spirit hallowed the sad spectacle with decoration of ideal grace, a dignity, a smoothness, like the works of Grecian art and purest poesy. It's those latter lines that I think are interesting and important here. So note, though, the analogy that's being drawn here between his dream of the Arab and in a sort of a romance type scene, and which he says has influenced and moved him and prepared him to receive and to some degree interpret a scene that he actually saw with his own eyes, namely a man who was drowned. But note the landscape in which the man who was drowned is found. It is one in which we could describe as a sublime landscape. There's a stillness, a quietness. There's unperturbed stillness. It's breathless. And at the same time, there's something that suggests that something is not quite right there, namely the heap of garments. And so there's a fear and anxiety that attends the scene as well. And that fear and the anxiety is soon demonstrated to be justified because, of course, then the man's face comes up to the surface. And of course, he's drowned and probably swollen by the drowning as well. And of course, he's a specter shape because he's white. All of these things would be sufficiently terrifying in and of themselves, but the scene was already sublime and was already terrifying. And yet Wordsworth talks about how this scene, which could have shaken him to his very core, had not done so because he had already imagined terrifying scenes in his own capacities for imagining, fostered by books like romances. And that's how he concludes with this. He had seen these sorts of sights before among the shining streams of fairyland, the forest of romance. Their spirit hallowed the sad spectacle with decoration of ideal grace. So it almost seems like it's a dream that he has seen there. And so his reading in the poetic works of others has prepared him to interpret the scenes of natural terror and cast upon them a sort of a visionary gleam, so that it seems like the works of poetry and the experiences of life, sublime and terrifying though they be, are of one accord. There's a unity that includes them both. And then he then moves on from that, and he talks probably about the 1001 Arabian Nights, because he said, a precious treasure had I long possessed, a little yellow canvas-colored book, a slender abstract of the Arabian tales. And from companions in a new abode, when first I learnt that this dear prize of mine was but a block hewn from a mighty quarry. So he has only a little extract from the larger corpus, and he wishes to have that book and saves for it, but he doesn't in the end get it. I'll skip over that a bit because we have a fair bit of material to cover today, but he will talk about the influence of reading such books in the midst of nature. And I just want to read a little extract from that. He says, line 476, and when thereafter to my father's house the holidays returned me, there to find that golden store of books which I had left, what joy was mine! How often in the course of those glad respites through a soft west wind ruffled the waters to the angler's wish, for a whole day together have I lain down by thy side, O Derwent, the river. Remember the Derwent, with which he began the entirety of the Prelude, the stream that suggests the spirit of nature in his presence in the same way that the wind does, but the murmuring stream, he calls it here, on the hot stones and in the glaring sun, and there have read, devouring as I read, defrauding the day's glory, desperate, till with a sudden bound of smart reproach, such as an idler deals with in his shame, I to the sport betook myself again. A gracious spirit o'er this earth presides, he says, and o'er the heart of man. Invisibly it comes, to works of unreproved delight and tendency benign, directing those who care not, know not, think not what they do. The tales that charm away the wakeful night in Araby, romances, legends penned for solace by dim light of monkish lamps, fictions for ladies of their love, devised by youthful squires, adventures endless, spun by the dismantled warrior in old age, out of the bowels of those very schemes in which his youth did first extravagate. These spread like day, and something in the shape of these will live till man shall be no more. Dumb yearnings, hidden appetites are ours, and they must have their food. And now he moves on to a passage in which that sense of closeness, proximity to nature, such that he can almost not distinguish it, and he can almost not distinguish his readings of romances and dreams from his experiences in the presence of nature, such that they be unreflected upon and so forth. And he will describe a falling away from that. And if you want a further account of that, have a look at his Immortality Ode that I mentioned earlier at the outset of the lecture, because he will reflect on that in language something similar to that in these lines as follows, 508. Our childhood sits, our simple childhood sits upon a throne that hath more power than all the elements. I guess not what this tells of being past, nor what it augurs of the life to come. But so it is. And in that dubious hour, that twilight when we first begin to see this dawning earth, to recognize, expect, and in the long probation that ensues, the time of trial, ere we learn to live in reconcilement with our stinted powers, to endure this state of meager vassalage, unwilling to forgo, confess, submit, uneasy and unsettled, yoke fellows to custom, mettlesome, and not yet tamed and humbled down. Oh, then we feel we know where we have friends. So the dreams that are captured in literary works of romances and so forth, we know we have friends there. There we meet true companions in our voyage that seem more close to us than any of the experiences that we are undergoing simply by living in this common world of men. So he says, ye dreamers then, for forgers of daring tales, we bless you then. Impostors, drivellers, dotards, as the ape philosophy will call you. So he now speaks back to the claim of the philosophers since Plato that the writers, the poets lie and tell deceits and possess nothing of the truth. Wordsworth argues back, on the contrary, there is a greater truth to those poetic fictions, although they be fictions, than there is to the reductionistic claims that he calls those of philosophy. He says, then we feel with what and how great might ye are in league, who make our wish our power, our thought a deed, an empire, a possession. Ye whom time and season serve, all faculties, to whom earth crouches the elements, are potter's clay. Space like a heaven, filled up with northern lights, here, nowhere, there, and everywhere at once. So the elements are like potter's clay, and of course the language here is used of from Scripture itself, where God is spoken of as a potter. He is the potter, we are the clay. Wordsworth is speaking now of the creative capacities of writers and the elements with which they craft their language, their stories, are the clay that they have formed. So he's talking about the creative powers of the artist here. But he says that he is sad. This is a few lines later, 545, for that lost innocence. And these are the notes with which he will conclude the book fifth before he moves on to his time at Cambridge and his more important venture into the Alps, which leads him to an understanding of himself that he did not here possess. But he speaks of the fall from innocence. Now, this is the typical romantic account of a sort of fall that is given account in Scripture. In the Bible, it's given, of course, of God placing a tree in the Garden of Eden, prohibiting Adam and Eve to eat of that tree. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat of that lest ye die. And they do. And thereafter ensues a fall. In the romantic account of the fall, there is no such transgression per se. The transgression is simply in growing older and in losing the visionary gleam that comes with childhood, when one is not particularly reflective and is simply experiencing everything vividly without the capacity for reflection, and enjoying everything, whether it's fictional or whether it's present, as if they were effectively the same thing. Wordsworth regards that sense of unity in childhood to be a good thing. On the other hand, he notes that children invariably move away from that, and he, in the Immortality Ode, laments the fact that they do so. Nonetheless, he will say that there is a capacity to recover that lost innocence. How does that work? In the Christian account, it's through repentance and faith in Christ, right? That's the Christian account. That's not Wordsworth's account. The romantic equivalent to this is through the imaginative recovery of what was lost, or rather walked away from, by the child's imitation of the world. So again, look at the Immortality Ode for a clearer demonstration of this. But for this part, let me just read from this passage, 545, and his lament at the loss of innocence, that he himself doesn't lose so much as abandons. He says, I am sad at thought of raptures now forever flown. Almost to tears I sometimes could be sad to think of, to read over many a page, poems withal of name, which at that time did never fail to entrance me, and are now dead in my eyes. Dead as a theatre fresh emptied of spectators. So the books that once entranced him now entrance him no more. Twice 5 years, or less, I might have seen, when first my mind with conscious pleasure opened to the charm of words in tuneful order, poetry, found them sweet for their own sakes, a passion and a power. And phrases please me, chosen for delight, for pomp or love. Oft in the public roads, yet unfrequented, while the morning light was yellowing the hilltops, I went abroad with a dear friend. And for the better part of 2 delightful hours, we strolled along by the still borders of the misty lake, repeating favorite verses with one voice, or conning more, as happy as the birds that around us chanted. So they are like natural creatures singing the words of poetry that they themselves deeply loved. Well might we be glad, lifted above the ground by airy fancies, more bright than madness or the dreams of wine. And though full oft the objects of our love were false, in their splendor overwrought, yet was there surely then no vulgar power working within us. Nothing less in truth than that most noble attribute of man, though yet untutored and inordinate, that wish for something loftier, more adorned than is the common aspect, daily garb of human life. So it's the desire for something greater. Now, C.S. Lewis will talk about this experience as the joy. And so will Wordsworth himself. In fact, he'll write a poem, Surprised by Joy. There's a delight in the natural world which transcends the natural world, which makes us long for more than we experience simply in the natural world. It's that thing that he is speaking to, a sense of a presence more deeply refused, and he finds it all around him there. That is it's the awakening of a spiritual sense that is not to be reduced, let alone to be found in the natural world. So he goes on and he says, what wonder then if sounds of exaltation echoed through the groves, for images and sentiments and words and everything encountered or pursued in that delicious world of poesy kept holiday, a never-ending show with music, incense, festival, and flowers. And I will conclude these lines here because I think they themselves are need to be, I'll read the rest of it. Of modesty, that he who in his youth a daily wanderer through woods and fields with living nature hath been intimate, not only in that raw unpracticed time is stirred to ecstasy, as others are, by glittering verse, but further doth receive, in measure only dealt out to himself, knowledge and increase of enduring joy from the great nature, capital N nature, that exists in works of mighty poets. So there's a greater power than exists in the works of the great poets. There's a sublime capacity for utterance that bespeaks of this joy that he senses also in the natural world around him, or in the transcendence of the natural world around him, actually. And he says, visionary power attends the motions of the viewless winds, embodied in the mystery of words. There, darkness makes abode, and all the host of shadowy things works endless changes. There is as in a mansion like their proper home. Even forms and substances are circumfused by that transparent veil with light divine, and through the turnings intricate of verse present themselves as objects recognized in flashes and with glory not their own. So he concludes again with the reflection on how books have played their part in this, but the part in which they play is not the substance of the books so much, or even captivated in the words that are a testimony to it, but a sense of the presence of a godlike presence, a transcendence. He sees this captured in the books as much as it's captured in nature. And so there is the part that the books have played in his own development, but it's no greater in the books than it is in the natural world. He almost gives them an equal weight, in the same way perhaps as the stone and the shell. did in the presence of the Arab that he dreamt of. They speak equally, and the shell is probably like the books, and there's a divine speaking through that. But the stone nonetheless had the same sort of power. Now, in book 6, the subtitle here is of Cambridge and the Alps. Cambridge is less important. It just gives us the sense of the time period in which he's writing when he will recount his voyage to the Alps. The voyage to the Alps is of absolutely crucial significance in his life for a couple of reasons. One being that he goes, remember, Wordsworth's born in 1770, French Revolution taking place in 1789. When he goes there, the French Revolution has happened, but it's not long thereafter that he is there. And while he is there, the outcome of the French Revolution is still being exalted and being delighted in. There's the overthrow of tyrannous power being celebrated in revolutionary fervor and a sense of anticipation of a new millennium for those who are of the Christian faith, something of a new heaven and a new earth, and a sense that tyranny has been broken and there's the brotherhood of man, the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. This is the spirit of the age. But he's writing this back now in 1804. We know this from line 48 here. He says, "The poet's soul was with me at that time," when he was in Cambridge. "Sweet meditations, the still overflow of present happiness, which future years lacked not anticipations. Tender dreams, no few of which have since been realized, and some remain. Hopes for my future life, 4 years and 30, told this very week." So Wordsworth 34, 1770, it puts it at 1804. Now again, he publishes this in 1805. So he's now telling of that time at a distance of something like 14 years or thereabouts. He says, "Have I been now a sojourner on the earth 34 years, by sorrow not unsmitten, yet for me life's morning radiance hath not left the hills. Her dew is on the flowers. Those were the days which also first emboldened me to trust with firmness, hitherto but lightly touched by such a daring thought, that I might leave some monument behind me which pure hearts should reverence." So at this time, perhaps for the first time, he fancies himself a poet of sufficient capacity to leave a great work, in the same way that Milton avers to in his own writing. And the echoes of Milton's languages are present here in Wordsworth's own work. And he says, "The instinctive humbleness maintained even by the very name and thought of poet, of printed books and authorship began to melt away, and further, the dread awe of mighty names was softened down and seemed approachable, admitting fellowship of modest sympathy. Such aspect now." So he's less intimidated by the language, by the name of poets, as sensing himself to be part of their company, in the same way, again, that Dante is admitted in the company of Virgil and the other epic poets. And so he proceeds onwards. And I will skip over the passage in Cambridge, not so much because it's irrelevant, but just simply because we lack time, and talk about his departure from Cambridge for a summer on an expedition. And the expedition is to go to the Alps. And not only the Alps, but to go particularly to Mont Blanc. Now, for those of you who have not seen Mont Blanc, you will certainly have heard of it. But Mont Blanc is the highest mountain in Europe, and since the 18th century, it is a place to which people go on expeditions to experience something of what we described already as a sublime landscape. The mount goes up into up into the clouds, and gives suggestions of an immensity, a grandeur in nature that bespeaks of a presence greater than nature. The fact that it defeats the eye as it goes up into the clouds, and the brightness of the light shining off the glaciers, all of that gives a sense of transcendence and power that gives a sense of smallness in comparison to it. So once again, what Burke described as the sublime landscape is Mont Blanc, and Wordsworth is going to experience that natural sublimity in his person. And so this is a significant passage. What will he make of Mont Blanc? Well, let's read something of this. But remember, it's not just Mont Blanc that he's seeing. He's passing through revolutionary France. Time of great upheaval, when power has been overthrown, when power has been seized, a time when the sublime power of mankind seems to have been awakened, and there have been blessings that are poured about as a consequence. And Wordsworth, in writing his epic, is speaking of a new sort of religious fervor that he himself is expressing and feeling, that arises out of nature, not out of custom, not out of tradition, not out of inheritance, not out of a sense of the divine right of kings, but rather of the common light of day which the humble shepherd himself may embrace. So it's very much speaking into the time period is Wordsworth's epic. Now, we saw that also, I mentioned Milton writing his epic in the time of a similarly Republican era, when the king had been executed. So that's all in the background here. But I'll pick it up, line 326. He says, sallying forth, we journeyed, he and a companion from Cambridge, journeyed side by side, bound to the distant Alps. A hardy slight rather, did this unprecedented course imply of college studies and their set rewards. Nor had, in truth, the scheme been formed by me without uneasy forethought of the pain, the censures, and ill omening of those to whom my worldly interests were dear. So he's abandoned his studies at Cambridge in order to go on this expedition. And he imagines the rebukes that he will receive in response to this. But nature then was sovereign in my mind, and mighty forms, seizing a youthful fancy, had given a charter to irregular hopes. In any age of uneventful calm among the nations, surely would my heart have been possessed by similar desire. But Europe at that time was thrilled with joy, France standing on the top of golden hours, and human nature seeming born again. French Revolution. Lightly equipped, and but a few brief looks cast on the white cliffs of our native shore. He leaves the cliffs of Dover, the white hills of Dover. He leaves there from the receding vessel's deck. We chanced to land at Calais on the very eve of that great federal day, July 14th, probably 1790, a year on from the day, Bastille Day. We chanced to land at Calais on the very eve of that great federal day, and there we saw in a mean city and among a few how bright a face is worn when joy of one is joy for tens of millions. So he sees in the face of mankind something of a sense of liberation in their very faces, the delight and joy of a new dawning of a new era. And so he goes through this, and he says that as he passes through as an Englishman, they are hospitably honored for the name of Englishman, and they are given hail as such, and so forth. And as he goes on through this, he also stays at a monastery. Let me go to this because this is also interesting. And he stays in the convent of Chartreuse, the Chartreusian Monastery, which is the chief monastery of the Chartreusian order. It's in the mountains near Grenoble, in the southeast of France. And it's a rocky precipice covered by snow much of the year. So already in the Alps, so it's in the French Alps. And I'll pick it up there in the convent of Chartreuse, line 418. There rested with an awful solitude. Yes, for even then no other than a place of soul-affecting solitude appeared that far-famed region. Though our eyes had seen, as towards the sacred mansion we advanced, the sacred mansion being Mont Blanc, arms flashing in a military glare of riotous men commissioned to expel the blameless inmates and belike subvert the frame of social being, which so long had bodied forth the ghostliness of things in silence visible and perpetual calm. Stay, stay your sacrilegious hands, the voice was nature's, uttered from her alpine throne. I heard it then and seem to hear it now. Your impious work forbear, perish what may, let this one temple last. Be this one spot of earth devoted to eternity. So not to war, not to carnage, not to power or ambition or bloodlust, but rather simply to eternity, to a sense of worship and honor there. And he says, she ceased to speak, but while St. Bruno's pines waved their dark tops, not silent as they wait, and while below, among their several beds, murmured the sister stream, life and death, thus by conflicting passions pressed, my heart responded, honor to the patriot's zeal, glory and hope to newborn liberty, hail to the mighty projects of the time. Discerning sword that justice wields, do thou go forth and prosper. And ye, purging fires up to the loftiest towns of pride ascend, fanned by the breath of angry providence. But oh, if past and future be the wings on whose support harmoniously conjoined moves the great spirit of human knowledge, spare these courts of mystery, where a step advance between the portals of the shadowy rocks leaves far behind life's treacherous vanities for penitential tears and trembling hopes exchange to equalize in God's pure sight monarch and peasant. Be the house redeemed with its unworldly votaries for the sake of conquest over sense hourly achieved through faith and meditative reason, resting upon the word of heaven imparted truth, calmly triumphant. So the Chartreusian Monastery, a place of prayer and of seclusion, which Wordsworth associates with solitude, and solitude being the experience of almost the necessary condition of sublimity, the mind in the presence of nature. He sees the monastery as a tribute to that long-standing sense and of worship in a natural context. But he says, let me move onwards, and he will move onwards. Says, 'tis not my present purpose, line 49, to retrace that variegated journey step by step. A march it was of military speed, and earth did change her images and forms before us, fast as clouds are changed in heaven, day after day, up early and down late. From hill to vale we drop, from vale to hill. They're going up and down the mountains through the Alps in direction Mont Blanc. And as he goes, as they go, I'll pick it up 523. Key passage. That very day, from a bare ridge, we also first beheld, unveiled, the summit of Mont Blanc. What would their response be to this? You would think they'd be delighted. They've traveled a very long way to see Mont Blanc. What's the response? And grieved to have a soulless image on the eye that had usurped upon a living thought that nevermore could be. Very interesting. They get there, they see the mountain, they're disappointed because now they have seen something that they had hitherto only imagined. And of course, the reality is not nearly as powerful as what they imagined it might be. So that's the first thing. It's a soulless image on the eye. Now, this says something about Wordsworth's view of the empirical realm, things that can be seen with eyes, ears, nose, seen with the eyes, smelt with the nose, touched with the hands, tasted with the mouth, heard with the ear. All of these things Wordsworth regards as relatively soulless. The spiritual aspect that imbues it, that's the thing that he has come to worship. And Mont Blanc, in and of itself, does not represent that. It's the idea of what Mont Blanc represents that is the thing that he comes to see. On we go. The wondrous vale of Chamonix stretched far below. It's the vale that's right before Mont Blanc. And soon with its dumb cataracts and streams of ice, remember I said it was a glacier, a motionless array of mighty waves, 5 rivers broad and vast, made rich amends and reconciled us to realities, where there small birds warble from the leafy trees, the eagle soars high in the element, there doth the reaper bind low sheaf, the maiden spread the haycock in the sun, while winter like a well-tamed lion walks, descending from the mountain to make sport among the cottages by beds of flowers. By the way, this description of Mont Blanc, you will see echoes of it if you read Percy Bysshe Shelley's Mont Blanc. We'll read that actually later on in the course. See some of the echoes of this passage in his. Whate'er in this wide circuit we beheld or heard was fitted to our unripe state of intellect and heart. With such a book, now he describes it as a book, before our eyes, we could not choose but read lessons of genuine brotherhood, the plane of universal reason of mankind, the truths of young and old, nor side by side pacing, 2 social pilgrims or alone, each with his own humor, could we fail to abound in dreams and fictions, pensively composed, dejection taken up for pleasure's sake, and gilded sympathies, the willow wreath, and sober posies of funereal flowers gathered among those solitudes sublime from formal gardens of the Lady Sorrow, that sweeten many a meditative hour. So in response to this, they are disappointed by the mere sight of Mont Blanc, and yet the thought and reflection, the sublime experience of which the mountain gives rise, that sublimity teaches them a lesson here, and they could not fail to understand the lesson, and the lesson is that of genuine brotherhood. Now remember, that's the lesson of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity, the brotherhood, and the liberty from the oppressive political structures and from the cities and from the ossified religious teachings that have lost their purchase on mankind. But as they go through this, and they're winding upwards, trying to seek the summit of Mont Blanc, they meet on that path a peasant. I'll pick it up at 579. A peasant met us, from whose mouth we learned that to the spot which had perplexed us first, we must descend. I've skipped over that a little bit. They had reached a place and a height, and they looked, how do we get up to the summit of Mont Blanc from here? They stopped. Their guide left them. They'd had a guide. The two Cambridge students had a guide that had left them, and the guide left them temporarily. And they decided after a while that they would wander on without him, and had moved on. And they meet a peasant, and the peasant tells them that they have to go back and their road, which in the stony channel of the stream lay a few steps. And then along its banks, and that for our future course, all plain to sight, was downwards with the course of the stream, with the current of that stream. What does this all mean? Well, loath to believe what we so grieve to hear, for still hopes that to the clouds, we question him again, and yet again. But every word that from the peasant's lips came in reply, translated by our feelings, ended in this: that we had crossed the Alps. Okay, so a passage of not particularly uproarious humor, but nonetheless some humor. They had gone on this long voyage to sea and to get to the summit of Mont Blanc, and thought that the passage in which they had place at which they had their that lunch was just a foothill, and they were going to continue on higher and higher and higher and higher. And then they find, lo and behold, that they'd actually not only been to the top, but had gone over it without even realizing it. Now, at that point, we could see a sense of great disappointment, but this gives rise to one of the great passages in Wordsworth's literary corpus, and that is his encomium to the imagination, his praise of a power within him that is greater than the mere experience of life is. In fact, it's his sense of disappointment that makes him aware of how much greater the imagination must be than any earthly reflection of that. So here's the passage, 592. Imagination, hear the power so called through sad incompetence of human speech, that awful power rose from the abyss, like an unuttered vapor that enwraps. At once some lonely traveler. I was lost, halted at an effort to break through, but to my conscious soul, I now can say, I recognize thy glory. In such strength of usurpation, when the light of sense goes out, but with a flash that has revealed the invisible world, doth greatness make abode. There harbors, whether we be young or old, our destiny, our being's heart and home, as is with infinitude, and only there, with infinitude, and only there. With hope it is, hope that can never die, effort and expectation and desire, and something evermore about to be. Famous line, something evermore about to be. Under such banners militant, the soul seeks for no trophies, struggles for no spoils that attest her powers, her prowess, blessed in thoughts that are their own perfection and reward, strong in herself and in beatitude that hides her, like the mighty flood of Nile poured from his font of Abyssinian clouds to fertilize the whole Egyptian plain. Now, what does the imagination get like testimony to? It gives testimony to the glory of the presence of God, and that presence of God is the presence of the imagination of infinitude lying within. So the great vision of blessing, which historically would be associated with the presence of God, see the face of God is the in a crevice in the cliff, because he may not hold his glory and glib, but he passes by him and he sees the train of his glory, the robe, merely that. He cannot see his face and live, but he can behold that, and he comes out and his face is shining, glowing, and the Israelites are terrified to see Moses with his face shining like this. But in response to Wordsworth's claim of glory, the glory that he sees isn't the face of God, it's the capacity within him to perceive the infinite power of the imagination within him, that capacity for infinite thoughts that gives rise to the sublime. Because remember, the sublime is the absence of something, not the presence of something. And it's the imagination which gives body to it in the terms of words, but really it's the absence of things. It's even the absence of words, which words testify to. And it's evoked by, again, images of solitude or silence or vacuity or absence or terror and so forth. But it's the soul that is being divinized here, its own soul. And this is the region of Wordsworth's song. I'll get to that when we look at another passage of his later on. But he says, in response to that, he around him in the landscape, he sees line 635, or where shall I pick it up? It just goes out, the sentences are so long, it's hard to pick it up in the middle here, but I'll pick it up in the middle anyway. 631, black drizzling crags that spake by the wayside as if a voice were in them, the sick sight and a giddy prospect of the raving stream and the unfettered clouds and regions of the heavens, tumult and peace, the darkness and the light, were all like workings of one mind, the features of the same face, blossoms upon one tree, characters of the great apocalypse, the types and symbols of eternity, of first and last and midst and without end. Now, this language here, explicitly of apocalypse, but implicitly also of types and characters of eternity. He's using typological language. Now, if you're in my Bible's literature course, I've talked about the way to read the Old Testament or the New Testament, the light of the Old, and vice versa, as a type and an antitype, as a promise and a fulfillment, as something that demonstrates guidelines, the revelation of God, and yet the fullness of that revelation doesn't become manifest until the New Testament and its fulfillment in the person and work of Jesus Christ, which itself, in a sense, is not fully revealed in the first coming and only will be in the second coming, which is testified to in the book of St. John, the Apocalypse, the second coming. Here he's talking about the natural world as sort of a book of Revelation, of an eternity that is here in its midst already. So now he's not, in other words, he's replacing the sense of the second coming with the sense of the second coming being already there in the sense of the infinite all around us, within our hearts, in the types and symbols of eternity that are everywhere all around him. So it's in this sense that Wordsworth believes that he is superseding Milton's poetic vision. He's not testifying to the coming of a Christ and his second coming and faith in him and living through that. He's talking about an imminent sense in which the heaven of heavens has already come. The second coming, the apocalypse, is here right now in the poet's own imaginative vision. Now, that passage that I've just read, I'm not going to get through this now, but he resides in London in Book 7th for a while, and talks about this as quite a dark period in his life, when things that, as he says in line 669, that things that are not as the mind answers to them, or the heart is prompt or slow to feel, when basically custom falls on the soul with freight as heavy as death, and they lose the inspiration that comes from the natural experience of infinity, which is easily forgotten in the city. That he catalogs in book 8, book 7 rather. In book 8, he gives us a retrospective. I'm going to have to pick it up next time because I've taken too long on this. But in book 8, with which I'll begin next time, he takes a retrospect and looks backward on what has happened up to this point and gives a plain description of that. The love of nature, which he described in his early years in the time of innocence, leads to a love of man in the end. That there, and that is through the awakening of the imagination, and the imagination is nothing other than a sense of the glory that he had in youth, but now with a sense of having lost that glory and only recovering it through the imagination. And the imagination being the faculty that has the capacity for sublime thoughts and for infinite joy and so forth. So that in turn leads him to the love of mankind as he describes it. Now, I will have, as I say, come back to that next time for lack of time, but we'll begin next time with book 8, and then we'll move onward from there, and I shall see you then. Get this thing to work. The end.